a second discussion of two so far. The first one we had was on surface congestion and the impact of surface transportation. So today we're going to be starting a second panel entitled "The Air Up There: Making Sense of Aviation Policy." My name is Suhail Khan, and I'm serving in the office of the Undersecretary Jeff Shane. And we have a embarrassment of riches, as it were, today with some good panelists to discuss this issue. First up, we're going to have Professor Ken Button of George Mason University. And then as soon as he gets here, I'm sure he's trying to find parking, Fred Smith from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And then we'll go ahead and have a discussion joined by our Assistant Secretary for Aviation Policy, Andy Steinberg, and our moderator for the discussion will be our own Assistant Secretary for Policy, Tyler Duvall. Let me go ahead and proceed. I will first introduce, as I said, Professor Button, and then hopefully Mr. Fred Smith will join us, and then we'll go right to the discussion. Ken Button is a professor of public policy at the George Mason School of Public Policy and a world-renowned expert on transportation policy. He has published or has impressed some 80 books and over 400 academic papers in the field of transportation economics, transport planning, environmental analysis, and industrial organization. Before coming to the School of Public Policy, Dr. Button was an advisor to the Secretary General of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, where he headed up the OECD's work on international aviation. Dr. Button has previously held visiting academic posts at the University of British Columbia and the University of California at Berkeley. In the 2 years prior to his secondment in the OECD, he completed consultancy work for the ICAO in Brazil, as well as studies for the European Union, Transport Canada, the European Conference of Ministers of Transport, the UN DDSMS, and the World Bank. He was a director of the transport consultancy firm Pierce, Sharp & Associates, which specialized in work on transportation. He was a special advisor to the UK House of Commons Transport Committee between 1993 and 1994. In 1990, he had been seconded to the OECD to assist in the preparation of the documentation for its 5 yearly meeting Ministers of Environment. So that will be our Professor Button. Fred Smith, when he gets here, hopefully, is the president and founder of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a free market public policy group established in 1984. Mr. Smith is a popular speaker at universities and conferences around the world and is also a frequent guest on national television and radio programs to discuss and debate regulatory initiatives and topical policy issues. Before founding CEI, Mr. Smith served as Director of Government Relations for the Council for a Competitive Economy, as a Senior Economist for the Association of American Railroads, and for 5 years as a Senior Policy Analyst at the Environmental Protection Agency. Currently, he sits on the Institut Turgot in Belgium. Mr. Smith holds a bachelor's degree in Theoretical Mathematics and Political Science from Tulane University, and he also has done graduate work in mathematics and applied mathematical economics at Harvard, SUNY at Buffalo, and the University of Pennsylvania. Andy Steinberg is the Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs in the Office of the Secretary. He was nominated by President Bush and confirmed on September 29, 2006 by the U.S. Senate following his confirmation hearing. As Assistant Secretary, Mr. Steinberg supervises the Office of Aviation and International Affairs with responsibility for licensing of U.S. and foreign airlines, formulating U.S. international aviation policy, and the administration of the Department's economic policies and programs designed to promote access to, competition in, and the health of the U.S. aviation system. Mr. Steinberg is also responsible for coordination of department policies and programs in all modes of international transportation and trade. Prior to joining the Office of the Secretary, Mr. Steinberg was appointed by President Bush as the FAA's Chief Counsel in May 2003. And prior to the U.S. DOT, he served in several positions as a lawyer in the private sector, including several in the travel and transportation industry. And finally, we're joined by our own Tyler Duvall, who is the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the Office of the Secretary of the U.S. Department. He was nominated by President Bush on January 17, 2006, and was confirmed on May 26, 2006 by the Senate following his confirmation hearing. Tyler currently works closely with the department's senior leadership in the development of transportation policies. From 2003 to May 2006, Tyler served as the Acting Assistant Secretary and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. Prior to that, he was Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Transportation, and in that role, Tyler advised the Assistant Secretary for Policy on a broad range of transportation policy and legal issues related to surface and maritime transportation. Prior to joining U.S. DOT, Tyler worked as an associate in the business and finance group of Hogan & Hartson, the largest law firm in Washington, D.C. Tyler received his law degree from the University of Virginia Law School and his Bachelor of Arts with a major in economics from the Washington Lee University. So with those introductions, I'd like to introduce Professor Button to share a few moments with us, and then we'll go to our discussion.
Thank you. A few PowerPoints here. I do apologize. Some of the PowerPoints may appear slightly peculiar. That's because I drew them up when I was in Turkey a few days ago, and some of the notation, therefore, is slightly atypical when it comes out on the PowerPoint. I feel I'm sort of cheating slightly here because I was asked to talk about making sense of aviation policy. Quite frankly, I can't make sense of it, but then again, I don't think I'm very atypical in that. I think many people find it difficult to make sense of aviation policy. I'd like to really do three things. First of all, explain some of the difficulties in having a policy regarding airlines, and explain why airlines are intrinsically unlikely to make a profit, and therefore going to be problematic almost into the foreseeable future. Secondly, a few words on air traffic control issues, and thirdly, perhaps a few words on the ongoing debate at the moment about allocating airport slots. Time won't be allocated equally, but I am quite happy to answer questions on any of those topics. First of all, we have an air transportation system which doesn't just involve airlines. One has to take off from somewhere. We have airports. One has air traffic control, both at the airport itself and in the immediate area, and flow control. So you have a whole set of institutions involved in air transportation policy, and the difficulty, it seems to me, in many occasions, is that the policy doesn't actually integrate the attributes and features of the various elements in this system. We tend to focus either on air transportation, airlines, airports, or air traffic control. I go to endless conferences on one other of those topics, but seldom conferences which contain people from all three groupings. Now, why are we interested in air transportation? Very briefly, it's a big industry. This is the global statistics. I'm going to use national statistics, international statistics, and overseas statistics because the difficulties in air transportation are not peculiar to America. Most countries in the world are having similar difficulties in defining policies. There are nuances, there are refinements, but the basic problems, it seems to me, are very much the same. The policy approaches do differ slightly, and perhaps we can learn a few lessons from them. But they're just a few facts and figures. Air transportation is a massive carrier of people, involves employing huge numbers of people globally. Importantly, and what's not up there, I don't think, is it accounts for 40% of world trade in value terms. It's very important. As an economist, I really don't care how many tons, gallons, or any other unit things are carried. Value is important to me, and aviation now carries about 40% of international trade by value. We have a few more figures there. It's about 1% of the US GDP, 1% of Western Europe GDP, and so on, so forth. These figures are available on the handout. I've extracted them from different sources, so you may get slightly different figures if you look them up. Ballpark, that's what you've got. We've also been very interested in regulating air transportation since it was developed by the Wright brothers. Indeed, even prior to the Wright brothers, there were prizes and incentives offered by governments to develop aviation for military and other reasons. And even from the word go, there were policy debates about whether the information gleaned by the Wright brothers should be publicly available or whether their patent rights should be protected. And that went on in courts to 1917, actually. They didn't patent the aircraft, they patented the method of steering it. And in fact, that was patented on a glider, not an aeroplane. So the early days were really debates about getting the innovation into place in the market, followed by an important period in the First World War of development. That really goes outside the bounds of normal civilian policy formation. The important phases really came in the 1920s and 30s, where air transportation was appreciated to be a major tool in national integration. And indeed, we had the US mail service subsidized air transportation for mail purposes in the 20s. And it was one of the earliest cases of corruption regarding the airline industry when the Postmaster General was found to be giving out favours, shall we say, when giving out contracts. Later on, the long-distance aviation developed, particularly fostered by Britain and other countries like Germany, in terms of linking up their empires. The Americans were less concerned with that, except for bringing in Hawaii, which the Pan American got involved in. Late 40s through the 1970s, we had massive amounts of regulation of aviation, both international and domestic. The reasons for that I'll talk about in a moment, but certainly there were massive interventions in the market. Then we came to a period in the late 1970s, early 80s, when we went through deregulation. There was disillusionment with the way the industry was regulated, and the regulations embraced controls of prices, market entry, as well as the normal things we talk about these days regarding environment and safety. Initiation of the policy was in the United States under the 77 Act, which deregulated domestic freight, 78, which deregulated domestic passenger transport. And in 1979, for the first time, the word open skies was mentioned in the United States for opening up international aviation. That took somewhat longer. 1980s saw another thrust. This was the deregulation of infrastructure. And I'll say a few words about that later on, but it is interesting, and I'll give you a few facts in a moment, that we deregulated operations, the airlines first, but left infrastructure heavily regulated and in many countries in public hands. Airports in this country, for example, are by and large owned by city authorities, municipalities. They're not owned by private companies. And more recently we moved on to environmental regulation. I'm going to say nothing really at all about that. These are just some facts and figures about the regulations. We see the initial deregulations were airlines. We move on very much later to deregulating, privatizing in different parts of the world, airports and air traffic control. NATS are the British Air Traffic Control System. The nature of liberalisation, this is where we move into some of the hieroglyphics and turkeys, differed very much between different parts of the world. The US went for a big bang approach. Basically, deregulation of the airlines was over 3 years, give or take a little bit. Europe, they took 10 to 15 years to deregulate. Different institutional context, different economic situation, different philosophies. So there were some changes, and one can compare the implications of sudden deregulation with slower deregulation by looking at the effects on the industry in the United States and in Europe, if you should so wish, because this, these things are important when deregulating airports and air traffic control as well. If you do it all at once, which means you get left with stranded costs, airlines with inappropriate equipment, or do you do it gradually, which allows equipment to be worn out, but in a sense allows the airlines to manipulate the system. So it's trade-offs. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. I want to get to the substance in a moment. The impact of this changes of airline deregulation are pretty well known in the States, so I'll give you a picture from Europe. This is what happened when they deregulated throughout the 1990s in Europe. Gradually, yield, which is the average fare on airlines, dropped significantly, and of course cargo rates came down as well. Significant reductions, 30% or so. And these don't include low-cost carriers, by the way. These are simply the fares being charged by the traditional large carriers in Europe. If you bring in the really low-cost carriers in Europe, like Ryanair, which makes flying with Southwest seem a positive luxury, true. True. It's the fact that now they've discovered that people can't afford to pay €5 for a bottle of water and have started removing one toilet from each aeroplane because no one needs to use them, and putting in extra seats. This is where I think you get real commercialized activities in these airlines. So it benefits in Europe just like the United States. Productivity went up, so efficiency of the industry went up. This again is European productivity figures. You get the same stuff from America. I'm just showing you the experience is universal. Now we still have policy concerns. We've deregulated the airlines, but what we find is the airlines are not making much money. In fact, in the United States, if you take the carriers, members of the association, the American Air Transport, the U.S. Air Transport Association, their average profit, their average operating margin between 1979 and 2002 is 0.4%. US industry earned 5.2% on average in that period. So essentially, the airlines were losing money because operating margins don't embrace capital costs, don't embrace other forms of overheads like taxation. So they've got low earnings. But I'll show you the same problem in Europe as well. Certain parts of the system are congested. This seems to have concentrated President Bush's mind very considerably over the last few days, and we see him reacting to the potential congestion over Thanksgiving, although the storms around Minneapolis and places may actually thwart some of his plans to smooth the airflow. We've got common standards of safety now. There's still concerns about making this more rigorous, and there are concerns over this. There's still felt a need to foster air service in poorer parts and more remote parts of countries and to do this more efficiently. And finally, we've got problems of environment. The last few I'm not going to talk about. I highlight them simply to show the issues extend beyond the ones I want to talk about. Why do airlines make low profit margins? Well, it's quite simple. People attribute it to a variety of things. My view is quite simple. If you're an airline, you've got a fixed cost. You're committed to provide a flight, if you're United, a flight, say, between Washington and San Francisco on January the 14th next year. So you've got a fixed cost. You've got to have an aircraft there on January the 14th, I think I said. You've got to have crew there. You've got to have food, limited amounts perhaps, fuel. You've got to have check-in staff. You've got a fixed cost to get that service off the ground on January the 14th. But you operate in a competitive market between Washington and San Francisco. So you try and put up a high fare to fill your seats. Very quickly you find you can't do that, and you've priced down to pure operating costs. And you do not therefore recover your capital costs. There's nothing remarkable about this. This happens when you have any form of competitive industry which has got a fixed cost. The economic analysis, if you want to read it, goes back to Francis Edgeworth, an Irish economy in the 19th century, but I tell you, you don't want to read it. He invented his own form of mathematics, and a third of his book is in literally classical Greek. But if you do churn through it, you'll find there's nothing new in this. When you've got a fixed cost and competition, very difficult to recover your costs. Coase won a Nobel Prize for talking about it, and Jacob Viner, a very eminent Chicago economist, wrote some famous papers in the 30s. So what did the airlines try to do? They tried to protect their positions with a variety of instruments to remove competition, essentially. Loyalty payments, frequent flyer programs, basically ties you in. Fortress hubs, monopoly power in major cities. Asymmetrical information, control over the old CRS systems, the booking systems, which is now defunct. They try and lower their costs, so they're slightly cheaper than their competitors. They engage in yield management. I've been looking at this in some detail recently, charging different customers a different fare. Indeed, I was reading today about a low-cost carrier flying, I think out of Oklahoma or somewhere, where the pilot actually asks which passengers got their $10 tickets, because no one believed they were $10 tickets. Out of my generosity, my 20-year-old daughter, let me correct myself, had her birthday on the 17th of November. So in Europe, I splashed out €17 so she could make a return trip from Paris to Barcelona by air. Southwest don't quite have these fares. They don't have competition here. But basically, other people pay higher fares, and you discriminate between passengers. And finally, airlines have tried to get monopoly power by forming alliances of various kinds. Has it worked? No. There's some. There are periods where it's not done too badly. This gives you data on the operating margins of airlines for Europe, for the US, and globally. And you can see they go up and down over time, largely corresponding to the trade cycle, the current slight problems in the US economy, and the rising fuel prices suggest that any transient profits airlines may be earning at the moment may be eroded away fairly quickly. But the interesting thing is not only do they go up and down, you'll notice nowhere do they reach 5.2%, the average for US industry over that sort of period. So earning way below US industry. The question is, why do people invest in these airlines? I'll mention a few reasons for that in a moment. But what is also interesting is while airlines don't make much money, these are various sets of figures. I've got numerous examples of this. I just simply put two up, reflecting periods in the late 1990s when the airlines were making small profits. One look at operating margins, the other looks at rates of return. The airlines make barely any money at all. They're the small the small ones on the right-hand side. As you look at the two graphs, one is for Europe and one is global. Doesn't matter where you take them, doesn't matter how you measure the financial situation. You'll find other elements in the air transport chain are making a financial return, a reasonable financial return in many cases. Many of them quite significant rates of return. They may need to. I'm not saying there's anything wrong in this. I'm just simply highlighting the fact airlines in the air transportation industry are the ones losing the money. The air transportation industry as a whole could very well be quite profitable. A few words about low-cost carriers, because they've come into the market and people say that, they're having a big impact in reducing the profitability of traditional carriers. Well, they certainly are. This is an example of two European low-cost carriers. I can't mention who they are, but one has its base in Paris and the other one's based in Dublin, and doesn't provide quite so many toilets as it used to on its aeroplanes. You'll find they've got lower costs. Why? They provide less things. You have to walk to your planes with Ryanair. You get very little food, but they're also more efficient. Ryanair pilots fly 900 hours a year. British Airways, 640. They get paid the same, so they're a third more efficient. Ryanair staff fly from a base. They always sleep at home. There's no repositioning of pilots or cabin crew, no hotel costs, no wastage of time. British Airways, Air France and others don't do that. And you have the same situation emerging in the United States. And Ryanair, under some other name, is starting operations out of Las Vegas. And it'll be quite interesting to see what's going to happen. But I do mention low-cost carriers because they are increasing their share in the market. Again, I show you European information. You're probably much more aware of the role of EasyJet, of JetBlue and Southwest in this country, and the role they're now taking in the market and pushing out the domestic carriers, traditional domestic carriers, who are increasingly becoming international in their orientation. Delta, for example, does about 20% of its business internationally now. So why do people invest in these airlines if they're losing money? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, there's the Las Vegas effect. We all know if we go to Las Vegas, the chances are we're going to lose money. But there is a chance you might hit the jackpot. And if you invested in Southwest in the 1990s, you hit the jackpot. Their shares performed extraordinarily well. Ryanair in Europe's the same. A lot of other low-cost carriers and traditional carriers out the market. So you can pick winners. So you can gamble in this market. Secondly, there's the cash cow argument, as I call it. Airlines actually have a lot of cash. Why? Because most people pay well in advance of their flights. Therefore, they usually got a big stock of money. And people have invested in airlines simply saying, we can make better use of this cash inside the sector, or they may simply been deceived, and there's some stories of banks being a little naive, saying they've got this money, they must be profitable. But there are reasons for doing it. There's the Tills argument. Going back to my diagram earlier of different returns in different parts of the air transport industry, we find airframe manufacturers make a profit, aero engine manufacturers and so on make profits. And what they do is actually use the airline to collect the money in. How do they get their profits? If airlines didn't buy their engines, didn't buy the airframes, didn't use the airports, they'd make no money. It's no accident when United was coming out of bankruptcy, one of the companies offering finance was General Electric, I believe, who are manufacturers of aircraft engines. They want to sell the aircraft engines, and it's a bit like a supermarket. The person working at the till collects the money, but it's the managers and shareholders who make the profits, and it's exactly the same with the airlines. And finally, airlines are sexy. Come on, people like aircraft. We go to airports and we have viewing decks to look at aircraft. We have people who love these little metal tubes that zap around the sky, and that does attract certain investors and certain type of people. Let's move on a little bit. So the airline industry's got problems. It's got difficulties. It's never going to make a profit. The methods it's used in the past to try and recover costs, and I'll just go back to reiterate this. The methods in the past it's used to try and recover costs, loyalty payments, frequent flyer programs, they're almost useless. I'm with United. I could use my frequent flyer miles to fly between, I don't know, Detroit and Des Moines. I hope no one comes from those delightful cities. But I can't really get out to Hawaii so easily using those mileage. Fortress hubs, hub busters, Southwest fly around them. Asymmetrical information, we all go to the computer to buy it. We all know what the cheapest tickets are. The airlines can't sell us something that's more expensive. It's impossible. Airlines lowering their costs. Well, they're lowering and lowering them, but as they all keep coming down, there's a point to which you can't reduce your costs much further. There's a limit. Yield management, charging people different prices, well, that's really been diluted with the lack of asymmetrical information. Alliances are now one possibility which they're trying to exploit. And that's why you're getting this strong international alliance movement with the merger. An alliance, by the way, I also include mergers in alliances. It's a simple extreme form of an alliance, in my view. You get these mergers and alliances, I'll separate them for convenience, taking place on almost unprecedented scales around the world and between quite significant carriers like Air France and KLM in Europe, and potentially between one or two carriers in this country. Of course, we had American and TWA and so on. But there's a lot of these alliances between small and large carriers, trying again to get market power. Whether they can sustain that or not is a different question, because whether that market power will be eroded gradually by low-cost carriers, I don't know. I suspect it will, and certainly some work I've been doing on airfares suggests there are difficulties. What about air navigation services? They've been posing some problems in this country. One has to refinance the FAA, otherwise a large number of people will be out of work and a large number of other people will remain on the ground. It's interesting looking at this, because if you start looking at the major air navigation service providers around the world, and I recently did a large study of 11 of them, in-depth studies, looking over a period of years of what's been going on, and these are sort of countries involved, what you find is there's some significant differences in the way air traffic control services, air navigation services are provided. In many countries, they are provided by non-profit organizations, strictly taken out of government control, and they raise their money through user fees. Britain is semi-privatized. We have a public-private partnership for its air navigation system. Two countries, France and America, have state-owned systems, the ones we looked at. Both are state-owned. America is much more, as I said in a recent article, much more Marxist in its orientation, because the American system basically is financed by taxation and has no user fees. In France, you at least have user fees, and not only that, they can raise money on the finance market. So France is slightly less Marxist than the United States, but you probably don't believe that. At least you're not all out on strike today anyway. It's a good thing. My daughter in Paris is swearing. She can't get around, the whole place on strike. But there are differences, and I want to emphasize that. And the difficulty is that the US is running into major problems. This is just some data, and I've not got the whole set down here so it's clear, but the picture's pretty general. This is minutes delayed per flight. There are various measures of delays and inefficiencies in the system. This is simply one. The picture's pretty generic, so I'll just give you the example. Most air traffic control systems improve their performance as a result of 2001. Less traffic. It's easy enough to handle fewer aircraft. Since that date, other aircraft air navigation systems have by and large stayed pretty steady or improved their performance, the one exception being the FAA. It's had major problems in terms of on-flight delivery of service. On-time delivery of service, should I say, on-flight as well. Although one must confess it's not got particularly more dangerous than some other systems. There's been some concern said about the potential accidents in the federal system in this country. In practice, its safety record is as good as anyone else. And by the way, the outlier there is Swissair. It's a Swiss system, and that's simply because they changed their definition. These are all based, by the way, on trends against their own performance, because we didn't try and compare countries. We simply said, had a country got better against its previous record? So we're not trying to say one country's better than the other. We're simply saying some are getting better against their record, some are getting worse, some staying the same. It's difficult to compare them because a death in Italy is not quite the same as a death in England, for example. You may look puzzled. In Italy, I think it's any deaths within 24 days of the accident. And in Britain, I think it's 7 days. There's differences like that. So actually comparing between countries is difficult for safety. And this also applies to air proxies, which are near misses. I recently did a study of the United States and found absolute zero correlation between near misses in aviation and actual accidents. So I'm not quite sure why we're measuring near misses in an aggregate sense. Of course, one may want to look at individual portions of the system where there may be accidents and there may be a lot of near misses, but in aggregate, comparing near misses and saying they're the same as danger is not quite the same.
The air traffic system, in my view, quite simply needs to be put on a much more commercial basis with appropriate pricing mechanisms and appropriate financial structures to fund the necessary development of it. I've written on that elsewhere. Allocating slots is something I'm interested in at the moment for a variety of reasons, and it seems to be a problem here. We've got a number of ways we allocate slots. The United States method is totally arbitrary. You can just turn up and land your aircraft, and it's sort of Buggins' term: first there, first in, first out. Very efficient. Basically, much more the Marxist system again, where if you turn up at the shop first, you pay your fee, and whether you're the most important or least important person, you get the service, and you get long lines of people queuing up outside. People forget what it was like before 1989 in Russia. You have exactly the same method for allocating out airport slots in this country. There's no question about it. Go read about the system in Russia before, not just aviation, anywhere in Russia before 1989. What are the alternatives so we can allocate more effectively? Congestion charges under serious consideration. Congestion charges, you basically charge more for slots which appear more attractive. The problem with this is actually calculating the charge. It involves employing economists and engineers to work out what the charge should be for different slots. Then, supposing someone owns a slot and that company goes bankrupt, what do you do with that slot? Because you somehow have to reallocate it. Who do you give it to? There are major problems with congestion charging, in my view, and it's totally unnecessary. It's a nice thing. I know many economists who wrote PhDs and earned a living on congestion pricing. Indeed, it's the best way of controlling traffic congestion in cities, but in my view, not for airports, because airports have purchases of an advanced product. You buy the slot in advance, and you haven't got an atomized market for buying them. You've got a limited number of airlines. So you can use a different mechanism for allocating these slots and making better use of them. Whatever you do, by the way, someone has to decide how many slots you've got. That's an engineering problem. But I'm concerned with allocating them in the most efficient way. One method is simply put them up in a lottery. Go along to Virginia Lottery and ask them to give them out in a lottery, and the winners take the slots. Then afterwards, the airlines can buy and sell the slots between themselves. And the ones that desperately need them will buy them from those which don't need them so much. They can buy a slot they need at X airport to gel with a takeoff at Y airport. They can organise amongst themselves. There's a tremendous invisible hand at work here, to use the term of Adam Smith. He actually used it 3 times in The Wealth of Nations. Not very often, but quite a powerful term nevertheless. You get the auctioning off, and the airlines that get the most value from slots will actually end up with them. The problem with this is it's rather arbitrary at the beginning. You win the slots, and there's sort of some concern about the gambling of this. It seems slightly amoral in a sense that you go and gamble to get these slots. The other option, which I prefer, is auctions. We actually auction off the slots. This is very similar, in fact, to the way they allocate road space on a road in, going back to road pricing in California, where you basically have a price, and the price drops, and when you're willing to pay it, you join the traffic flow. Works very well. There's various forms of auctions. There's Dutch auctions where the price comes down. There's English auctions where the price goes up. There's sealed bid auctions where you put in confidential bids. There's Vickery auctions where the person putting in the highest bid gets the slot but pays the second highest price. And Vickery got a Nobel Prize for this, so there must be some merit in that. It may take a little intuitive thought to get there. There's different ways of doing the auction. Once the slots have been auctioned, you have to allow the airlines to buy or sell them because they change value over time. You do this, they may have the slots for 6 months. Well, over 6 months, the demand may go up and down. They can buy and sell them. There's a difficulty with auctions, and it's a difficulty you get with anything involving government. How the heck do you spend the money? Because the big concern with anything like this is it's not strict market mechanisms. It's defining a certain product, number of slots, and then selling it efficiently. That gives a flow of money to the government. And the big concern in many of these areas, it transpires, is actually no one trusts the government to spend that money wisely. We see this endlessly. There are ways around this. You can have a system where the airport has to spend money on the airport facilities. This could also be used for slots for air traffic control, or the money spent on the air traffic control facilities. But nevertheless, there are issues on how you actually spend the money. But I would argue that auctions are by far and away the easiest way of allocating and most efficient way of allocating out slots at airports and through air traffic control. There are difficulties, but I tell you what, it will be one heck of a lot more efficient than what we've got now. I can give you plenty of equations and plenty of pages of mathematics to prove how efficient it is. It will never work like that. You'll never get an optimal outcome. You'll simply make the system one heck of a lot better than what you've got now. So in a sense, I can't make sense of what your policy should be at the moment. I've no clue why you have the policies you do. They're totally mad in my eyes. All I can say is there are ways in which we can circumvent some of the difficulties and move forward. I'm sorry I spoke quickly, but I was trying to cover 3 topics in a short time.
Thanks, Professor Button. We are now joined by Fred Smith. And I assured Fred that we read his bio before he got here, so I don't know who you are. But maybe we can move that microphone, Professor. We can hear Fred's comments.
If it doesn't go, you have to switch seats.
I'll change seats with you.
Careful the leads. It's a dangerous place.
Oh. I thought I'd add a little bit of an introduction. Some of you realize the burning issue in public policy today is not air traffic, it's not things. It's whether or not water should be drunk out of a tap or out of a bottle. Well, I enter this sweepstakes. This is Fred water. It's natural spring water. I just found out about it and bought a case of it because this water is born beneath the Catskill Mountains. Fred is velvetly smooth, spring water with exceptional virginity and a balanced pH. Now, how many people can introduce themselves with that kind of an introduction? What I'd like to do is, I'm basically going to put out some of the things Ken said and give a little bit of a sort of a gloss of the work he does. I think we have areas of agreement, disagreement, but mostly I think the areas are, Ken's a bit of a realistic cynic, I take it. He understands that there are areas where, in theory, we can make a difference, but in practice, politics may get in the way. The way the debate about how we should be handling the whole air travel, the economics of air travel, is a classic debate, not a classic debate, an emerging debate in the whole economics profession between 2 ways of looking at what a market is all about. Is it about pricing and quota policies, which is what market mechanisms are all about, or is it about the institutional relations with which the resources that are involved are owned and managed and so on? Are prices primary, or are prices just a derived result from the institutional framework in which we think of air travel emerging? My view is that an institutionalist approach. This is Kosian pretty much. The air travel system, in my view, is a network. It has 2 elements. It has the mobile element, the airplanes that fly around the world, and the grids, the airways in the sky, the airports that it travels to and from. Like electricity, the generators of electricity, the power itself, and then the wires over which it flows and all the distribution systems. The e-commerce world where we have our computers and we have our internet. The telephones where we have the wires and we have our generating of information systems. Waterways, canals and barges. And the trucking industry, roads and trucks. The investment and operating decisions that link those 2 elements are very, very interrelated. And in many reasons, that suggests the natural form of institution one thinks might evolve in networks would be integration. You would have the flows and the grids operated by the same parties, and competition would emerge not by the flows competing with the flows, but by a network competing with a network. And indeed, if you know much of your transportation history, you find out that the so-called union railroad stations, which are in most cities passenger railroad stations, emerged by a sort of a coercive effort to force out competition so we could have the unified efficiencies of one form of terminal. Everybody would have to go to sort of a common carriage obligation. You saw the same thing happening in most other industries. When we deregulated, when we liberalized these industries somewhat, the last real wave of economic liberalization in the United States goes back to the 80s, really. We haven't seen really much since then. And we almost always did it wrong with network industries. When we deregulated electricity, we essentially said, let's free the generation capacity, thinking that's easy, and let's leave the grids as politically regulated geographic monopolies. And the result that has happened in virtually every other form of network deregulation of this type is the freed up section performed much better. It actually increased its ability to offer quality services at reasonable prices, and the flows increased dramatically, hit the grid that was totally rigid or still non-incentivized to expand, and certainly not easily expandable because there was no linkage between the flow changes and the grid capacities, and we ended up with blackouts, we ended up with congestion in the airline industry and so forth. And that's not atypical. The one exception to this, and this is, I was at the railroad, I guess you mentioned, I was at the railroad industry for a while during its heyday. It's really one of the only industries in the Western world that actually collaborated in its emancipation. Most industries fight like hell against being freed and thrown into the market. Most of you know the line about that George Stigler quotes, that businessmen generally believe that competition, like exercise, is very good for other people. And certainly the airline industry and the trucking industry fought like hell against being thrown out into that cruel, creative, destructive world of the marketplace. But poor institutional designs create poor results, and I think we've seen them. Ken did a beautiful job of explaining them. They're not great anywhere, but they're particularly bad in the United States, or at least pretty bad in the United States. Once America sort of focused in these network sectors, we thought we had lots of money. It was, excuse our dust, but build we must. We had a sort of supply-side management approach. Build lots of airports, build lots of towers, and so forth. But now, obviously, America and the world have shifted to a demand-side management approach. We're much less optimistic about our future. Maybe it's time to live in a diminishing world. You've all heard your friends, or maybe some of you are Malthusians. We're already a non-sustainable society, and it's time to live in a world where our grandchildren have a horrible life, and we shouldn't blow over too much. Let's enjoy as much as we can before they realize it and then throw us under the wheelbarrow, too. We have NIMBY, not in our backyard, a banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anywhere. And of course, NOPE, the California variant, not on planet Earth. All of those trends are very natural of a wealthy society. As a society gets wealthier, you naturally think of stability as a good thing. Once you're on top of the hill, it looks a lot better than being down at the bottom or even having the risk of being thrown down at the bottom. But my view is this, and this is a much bigger topic, sustainable development is not a static equilibrium concept. It can't be. Nothing we're doing in the world today can be sustained over the next century. Not our energy usages, not our material uses, not anything we're doing. We live in an Alice in Wonderland world. To do as well in the future as we're doing now, we have to run. To do better, we're going to have to run a lot faster, and the last century plus illustrates that free markets, properly incentivized, can actually achieve that result. But we also realize that any time we stop running, as we see in Europe, as we see in parts of the United States economy, as we see in lots of the world, we start slowing down, we start losing out to the Ryanairs of the world. We all hate the Ryanairs of the world, but those are the ones that keep us running as fast as we do run. The use of a demand-side management approaches, which is to say, okay, let's accept the institutional framework as it is, and let's ration use in various creative ways. Slot allocation, slot auctioning, congestion fees, and so on. I must confess, many years ago, I was one of the world's experts on highway cost pricing, highway cost allocation, and so on. I was a Pigouvian. I was a believer that wise economists knew the price of everything, the value of almost nothing, but the price of almost everything. And given me a chance and let me at the levers of this economic mechanism called the market, and I could fine-tune ourselves into having no congestion, no pollution, no inequities in society, and so on. Well, as you grow up, you realize that politics gets between the analyst and reality, and whatever starts out as a precise analytically derived result, rightly or wrongly, mostly wrongly, but even rightly, what happens at the other end is going to bear no resemblance to that. Taxing, after all, is a fairly simple idea. We have to raise revenues to run a government. But the tax code doesn't look like that. The tax code looks like that because every provision in that has been fought over fiercely by many, many interest groups, and as a result, tax reform almost always makes things worse. And this could be an example, too. The partial deregulation of the air traffic control, of the air travel system, has left behind both the airports and the air traffic control system. I think that's the general view. We've liberalized and not liberalized an integrated industry, and not surprising, a faster turning wheel starts clogging down when the other wheel goes too slowly. And you hear it, we can just go through some examples and talk about it in discussions. There's some of the papers that Bob Poole at the Reason Foundation, who's achieved what everyone in my field wants to do, moving from the painful job of not only running an organization, trying to squeeze out time for policy work, but also trying to figure out where the hell the money is going to come from to meet next week's payrolls, to the job of Bob Poole, where he is now emeritus and gets to do the fun part of doing policy analysis. He's done a series of papers recently on airport, and I guess many of you will have read those. One of the interesting things that comes through when you read them, Bob is more of a technocrat than I am. He's free market type, but he is definitely on the pricing side. We can make this work if the politicians will leave us alone. But he has some interesting points about what's happening in airports and so on. Not just the big stuff, but the little things like, why isn't luggage handling more smoothly managed in American airports? Why isn't it easier to shift gates around? Look at a supermarket. You walk in a supermarket at this time of the year, this week, and you see massive lines, and you see redeployment of resources, people rushing out, new lanes opening up. The lines start magically disappearing, and it goes back in. You see some pricing effects, but mostly it's in terms of dynamic redeployment of processing capacity. Why is it so hard to do that in airports? Well, I would argue part of it is the incentive structure of an airport manager is quite different than the incentive structure of an airline. And the quasi-private, quasi-political nature of airports means that there are many rigidities. It's not easy to relocate a gate when that gate's under a 4 or 5 year lease right, and with unions and all, it gets worse. Although in Europe that should be worse, and it appears to be better in Europe in part.
Why? France has less unionized labour than America.
There you go. See, wrong again.
Believe it or not.
Well, they surely have many more people who go on strikes than in America. I don't understand about that. It would be interesting, and I don't know this, and maybe Ken does, why FedEx works. I mean, if you go to a FedEx terminal and there's an unexpected surge of traffic, does the flexibility work much better and so forth? One expects so, but one's not sure. How do trucking terminals work? You know, we talked about the hub and spoke system and the massive change in the capacity requirements that led to the hub airports. And many people blame the congestion strictly on that, although, as many of you know, there were some tremendous economies in that situation too. But the big growth in hub and spokes and transportation networks that were partially deregulated did not occur in the airlines. It occurred in the trucking industry. When the trucking industry was deregulated, essentially you could redeploy your resources. You moved from regional to national companies, and you could interline and do all kinds of creative things. You could go national. And what happened was hubs got built everywhere, mostly in highly remote locations off of interstate highways, where you could essentially drive all your trucks to an area, load and offload, like Federal Express does in the air industry, and send them back out again. But it's easier to start a hub in the trucking sector than it is to start a hub in the airline industry. You don't need a DOT overseer to tell you the trucks are coming in and out safely from the parking lot. You do have to have that in the airline industry, and I think one of the reasons airlines have reacted, or the air travel industry has reacted worse to increasing use than the trucking industry, is because this it's been harder to achieve the relevant capacity expansion in the area. The other reason, of course, is that the separate incentives, the management incentives of the airlines on one hand and the political entities running the airports and then the FAA, is that you have a profit-oriented system and a difficult to quantify, but a politically oriented system. Things that are perfectly reasonable in the marketplace, can use the term discriminatory. I do not like the term discriminatory. Economists are not very good at selling intellectually respectable ideas. They use terms like discrimination and predatory pricing and monopoly and monopoly power and so on. There are other ways of describing these rather than discriminating between one and the other. You can recognize the value of diversity pricing. Diversity pricing is the ability to recognize the diverse abilities we all do and the diverse values we do, and therefore achieve a more close approximation of the demand curve. And to do that intelligently is part of the things that any industry facing declining marginal cost has to do. It has to find a better way of explaining that and legitimizing that to the political process, which regards all this with great suspicion. In fact, under traditional U.S. antitrust regulatory law, it's almost illegal. In parts of Europe, it is illegal, and so on. One of the problems that Ken alluded to, and it's actually one of the areas of tremendous interest to anyone in theoretical economics. LowCost was, oh my God, he's just incredibly great. He's one of the, he wrote 5 things, and you could throw away all the economic textbooks in the world, I think, and read him over and over again and absorb everything you need. But he pointed out that a lot of industries face this declining marginal cost issue. It costs a lot to produce the first seat on an airplane, the first unit of electricity, the first microchip, etc. But it can cost vastly less to produce the second, the third, pharmaceutical products, and so on. Why would anyone engage in the effort to produce that first when knowing how easy it could be for then an interloper to rush in and copy the residual ones? Well, it's a good question. There are lots of industries like this. Probably half of the modern economy falls into this category. Pharmaceuticals, much of the electronic industry, almost all things that are protected by intellectual property generally. And there are a whole array of strategies in industry have thought to do these. One of them is intellectual property, a special grant of a monopoly privilege for allegedly, at least possibly, social purposes. There are the diversity pricing rules, where you try to find creative ways of looking at everyone out there and say, on average, you guys would much prefer to have my airplane take off than not. But all of you would like the lowest possible price, but some of you would not fly if the price went above 17 euros for his daughter. He actually is more generous than that. He would have probably gone up to 100 euros.
Don't kid yourself.
But the idea is you'd have that kind of, but you also have things like vertical integration. Why hasn't vertical integration happened more in this industry? Why aren't airports owned by consortiums of airlines? More significantly and more trivially, why haven't airlines in the United States? Airlines are probably air travel is the most global industry in the world, and yet you have the most balkanized industry in the world. Why is that? You all know we have national rules that prohibit foreigners from investing in airlines over a certain amount. Not in things like automobile industry, not in things, well, the only 2 industries are, well, 3, nuclear, airlines, and communications. Everywhere else we have a free market and capital flows around the world, thank God. But in this one sector, the one that obviously in some sense would be the most logical candidate for globalization, we're blocked in doing it. So there are tremendous efficiencies that are blocked in this area. DOT, to its credit, has fought this issue and lost and lost and lost. But it's one of those issues that one would hope eventually. We and the French, anyone else have it that badly? Or no? Yeah, we are very much like the French. And it's like the reason the French have this congestion pricing, the French Minister of Energy, wasn't he, or Transportation? The one who got the the one who got the Nobel Prize,
Hélas.
The only Nobel Prize winner, to my knowledge, who was a cabinet official, was in the French government. He went to Polytech, which all brilliant French go to. And when you walk out of the Polytech, you are God. You can run the world. And so he sat down and planned the pricing policies for Electricité de France and so on. Years later, it was turned out that all of that was a wonderful show. They actually made pricing policies like everyone else does by doing this. But this whole mathematization in front of it gave people the illusion that science, not politics, was making the difference. The French are great at this, but they cook well. I mean, if you got to figure that. Truck and spoke. These are the less of thoughts I was putting together when I said it. One of the things is revenue control. We talked about that a bit. When government charges, the problem is, what is it going to use the money for? Now, in principle, of course, government is a wise, thoughtful group and would never overcharge anyone. And it would certainly use the monies in a creative, effective way. We've seen that in the Washington, D.C. tax system recently. $31 million they couldn't account for. And there are problems with this in the use of pricing mechanisms in the transportation sector. It's the Delaware cash cow bridge, in a sense. The Delaware is not a big state. It's very difficult not to go through it, though, and they collect. Was it an unreasonable amount? Not necessarily, but it's certainly not all used to maintain the Delaware toll road. On the other hand, I come from Louisiana, a state that some of you know is notable for its Washington-style politics. Louisiana is a state that does not tolerate corruption. We insist upon it. And it's one of the states that essentially has a dedicated fee for a dedicated purpose. It's our control of our flooding. We have the New Orleans Levee Board, which was a cash cow for a very long period of time. They built a few levees, but levees are sort of boring. Then they started building fountains and gambling boats and parks and casinos. And And they probably, in retrospect, should have built a few levees. But the problem of controlling the actual flow of revenue from a political institution is not easy. There's always, in principle, a long-term public interest investment that would be wisely carried out. But in practice, politics can get in the way. And unfortunately, how does one avoid it? There's no easy way of doing that if you don't have a co-management structure. So I think one of the things we really should be thinking about is how to ensure that the groups paying the taxes and the groups using the taxes have some sort of checks and balances, some sort of co-management system. We can't go to private ownership overnight. We have to move in that direction. One of the other risks we see when we get into the question of pricing policies is, you alluded to it a little bit in your ladder too. There's a massive feeling in the world today that we're gone too far, we're over-consuming, we have to ration back in various ways. Energy rationing, and one of the side issues of that has become airline rationing. Have any of you seen some of the YouTube videos on air travel? The Spurt one, or have you? No? Well, YouTube is a great way of wasting a lot of time, but also it is a tremendous instructional tool, I think, in giving a flavor of how virulent anti-market forces have become around the world. This one shows looking like a British air official, but it was certainly a British accent, palmy, snotty looking, has tied a guy to the side of a tree, and he's talking about, now, you don't like air travel, you're wrong, it doesn't pollute, it's good for the environment and so on. And he has this lecture about it, and then he shows how many airports they need, and you're just covering it. It's run by Greenpeace. It's a very effective anti-travel ad. You saw already Cameron's government changed, but Cameron's government was talking about how the moral goal of the new Conservatives was to become green and to ensure that no one in Europe, or at least in England, took unnecessary trips, which seemed to be all trips, certainly trips by Ryanair, I had the impression. But that movement stopped because it turns out people like air travel, actually. But there is a real risk if we give this kind of a tool to people who really would like to see dramatic curtailments in consumption and travel. Not for us, because we're traveling in a rational, thoughtful way, but for all those wasteful people over there who are necessarily traveling around the world, we should basically then do something about that. And Red Ken has certainly reduced congestion in downtown London, but he's done it by essentially making it almost impossible for average people to travel in downtown London. Look, the question about how do we move in this direction, whether we do more creative ideas to have pricing and rationing allocation coupons working better, there's a role for that. That's part of my life, part of Ken's and so on. But it's a very difficult system to pilot through the politics we deal with today. The other is, I think, to reopen the question is whether the institutional arrangements we've pursued to manage the infrastructure part, the grid part of the air travel system was poorly considered, and whether it's time to rethink that. I think there's a value in that latter approach, because one of the geniuses of those who believe in government intervention is that they always give idealistic solutions. They always have a utopian answer that will solve all these problems. It's not something we can do today, but in the long run, we'll have this glorious universal airline system with common carriage obligations that will get us back to democratic, egalitarian flows around the world. And although that's not very realistic today, it does point in the direction of increasing the government intervention and control over air travel. I think the vision that those of us who actually believe that it would be better left to the specialized institutions that can and hopefully could do more in the future, provide quality, safe, egalitarian air travel, is institutional. We need to explore that more, and it's something we can discuss. Thank you.
Okay, we got 20 minutes. I'll do one question and then open it up to anybody in the crowd who has questions. The question really goes to these smart gentlemen just gave what I perceive as a very bleak portrayal of U.S. transportation policy, which is, frankly, well-deserved in a lot of cases. And I guess my question to you all and to Andy is, out of the bleakness, is there any hope on the horizon? And given your studying of transformational movements, not just in transportation but in the broader economy, what do you think it will take to unlock forces of positive change in the transportation sector, and particularly in aviation? What do you think it will take? A full-blown crisis, an incremental crisis, or some great political leadership, or a combination?
Sorry, I'm sort of the world's aviation, transport, and every other problem. Basically, if you look at most politics, the majority of politics is crisis management, and many of the crises are brought on by politics themselves in the first place. The air transportation system, the amazing thing is that people actually complain about air transportation, and these are people who 20 years ago would never had a hope in hell of flying. You know, they wouldn't be able to afford it or anything else. The services weren't available. I mean, so it's an interesting situation where, in a way, once you get something which is, in a sense, relatively successful, people want more. You know, it becomes addictive. And they also somehow think that you get continual improvements the entire time. Well, there are plateaus, and perhaps we're reaching some sort of plateau and we need to regroup, reorganize, and restructure, and perhaps policymakers need to think not of some utopian future, although they obviously espouse those views for political reasons, but really thinking about a practical way of making sure that we do get these disparate elements. You quite rightly separated out the sort of movement side from the fixed side. The better thing, the difficulty is actually get the two mentalities together. It's very interesting in transportation that the people who have the biggest say in transportation are actually the people who provide the infrastructure, and they're the people who provide something that doesn't move. We've got experts in non-movement determining transportation. And I think the change is that we ought to somehow integrate these fixed views or the views of the industry. And at least now I find it quite encouraging. You do get discussions between airlines and the fixed infrastructure. The British air traffic control system, a large chunk of the shares are actually owned by 5 airlines. I think it's 5. We have situations in this country where on the road you get, you talked about the general transport situation where the engineers do consult the trucking companies and so on. I mean, it's a gradual movement forward. We're getting some integration. But certainly in the old days, you used to have a situation where the road people never talked to the bus people, the airlines never talked to the airports, and the air traffic control people were a group of guys in some remote location with computers. I mean, the world is getting better. Please.
No, I think that's generally the question of what makes reform possible is the biggest question in public policy. I've just read another book last night discussing all of the reforms in Europe in the last 20 years. And when you go through them, one nation has tax reform, another has labor regulatory reform, another has electricity reform. They're all interesting, and each has a little unique story, but coming out with generalized rules is very difficult. You can say something about the deregulation of the railroad industry. The railroad industry was going bankrupt. I mean, it was a choice between taking the Conrail model, which is some of you economic historians know, the eastern United States railroads went bankrupt. The government thought it was going to be easy to put them back on its feet again quickly, and 10 years later or more, it finally struggled through to make it happen. But by that time, all the other railroads had become tremendously weakened, and the Congress looked in the face of the Congress of the United States micromanaging a railroad system and realized that they didn't want to get blamed when the trains didn't run on time, and they deregulated instead. And as many of you know, I would argue because the railroads were deregulated as a network for accidental reasons having to do with the history of regulation. But we actually had regulated grid laying on top of grid. We regulated everything, but there still was the structure of the Southern and the Burlington Northern and all these others right on top of each other. So when we deregulated, we went back to competing grids, and after the shakeout, the competing grids worked very well. They also have some very creative joint venture arrangements because all these are competing grids. There's a massive amount of interdependency among the various railroads, and they have things called CORPAC or CORTRAC or something like that. You can imagine those kind of joint ventures emerging much more quickly in the airline industry. And maybe, in fact, one of the things we ought to consider is whether or not the British model of at least creating an advisory committee which could have quasi-advisory panels, even in today's politicized FAA system. Because right now, though, why would the FAA want that? Right now, when you get on an airplane and there's a delay, everyone's, not me, because I'm a reasonable person, but all the people sitting next to me on the airplane start bitching irrationally about those goddamn airlines are lying to us again. What are they doing? They keep saying air traffic control. Yeah, I've never seen an air traffic controller in my life. Well, of course you haven't. The only people you see are the people in the airlines, and whether they're guilty or not, they're going to get the blame. So Why would the FAA rush forward and say, we're partly responsible too? It's an institutional problem.
Here. I don't think that airlines are intrinsically unprofitable. I do think they're unprofitable in the current regulatory and legislative that we have in this country. If you look at other travel providers, excluding now the infrastructure providers, I'm talking about rental car companies, hoteliers, and so on, they've actually tended to be quite profitable over time. And they have many, but not all, of the same attributes to their business that airlines. Hotel rooms slept in, goes away every night. The car that isn't rented, sits there. A lot of this, frankly, comes down to the amount of the number of companies in the business and the levels of competition, and an inability of the incumbents to have any form of pricing power, which if you've had the occasion to get a hotel room in New York recently, you know that there's significant pricing power, but it probably was not that expensive to fly up there if you ever got there. So, I mean, that's the first point I would make. The second point is our bankruptcy laws actually have some elements that are unique to the airline industry, including, very importantly, a provision that was put in about 15 years ago that protects aircraft lessors. And it was put in order to prevent a scenario where lessors would risk their capital assets and would be just like other creditors in bankruptcy. But the perverse effect of it is to encourage risky lending practices to airlines. And if you look at what's happened over the last few years, the airlines that have I often joke that the price of success is failure in this industry, because if you look at the airlines that have chosen not to file for bankruptcy, which is at this point just American and Southwest over their histories, they're both encountering more problems because their cost structures are quote, too high, close quote. Why are they too high? Because the others have reduced theirs by rejecting their contracts. Third point is there are a number of areas in which our existing regulations do prevent the airlines from optimizing their sales. So look at security regulations. What we've done is made the experience so unpleasant that we have driven away tons of business travelers on whom the airlines made a lot of money. The net result of that is the break-even load factor for the legacy carriers has gone up to over 80%. I used to work in the airline business, and it was absolutely unheard of to have a 60% load factor. And now we have 80% load factors. What that means is that at busy times of day, every seat is sold. If there's any problem, there's no ability to reaccommodate passengers. Right, so we've made, then this is a cyclical problem. The experience has become so bad that we've now accustomed business travelers to try to find other options. Next point, perfect price competition, I think, has been around this industry for a long time. There aren't too many businesses where you can get worldwide prominent distribution of your product the day after you launch. We've seen that when JetBlue finally decided to go into CRSs, it immediately turned around its losses. Last point on this area is, in a perverse way, our safety regulations have done such a good job that they have eliminated any ability on the part of legacy or existing carriers to sell safe as part of their value equation. Most people in this country wouldn't hesitate to get on a bankrupt carrier, but if you were going to an airport and the taxi driver was bankrupt and had cut his maintenance cost by 30%, you might ask for the next cab. Well, that doesn't happen here because we ensure that everybody is safe. So, you know, for all of those reasons, it's been very difficult for airlines to make money, and some of those would have to change if we wanted to have more profitable industry.
Can I follow up just a little bit on that? I don't think economists really understand why some declining marginal cost industries are very profitable and some are very marginal. And I certainly don't think it's just the declining marginal cost because, as you say, yield management, airlines probably have the most sophisticated diversity pricing rules the world's ever seen, and yet even then they can't squeeze a major profitability out of it. I think bankruptcy is certainly one of the things. Those of you who knew the former president of American Airlines, Crandall, would rave about this one for days and days at a time. He kept competing against Continental, and Continental could rewrite all their labor contracts because they'd gone bankrupt. He couldn't.
You should ask Andy which airline he worked for.
Oh, did you work for American? Okay. Global mergers I think, are still. That isn't going to happen in the current political environment. But let's suppose an American and a United both face bankruptcy, and you had an Air France and a British Air willing to be partners. Congress might finally be merged to change the laws in that. That's how sometimes you get major changes because the alternatives are much worse than finally biting a political bullet.
Can I come back on the marginal cost issue? I've been looking at a number of air routes in Europe and the United States. I've been looking at particular service and looking at how the fare profiles offered up to the takeoff point vary. If you've got a monopoly carrier on a route, the fare goes up gradually to the point of takeoff and gets very high if you buy the ticket before the day of that service. As soon as you get a second or third carrier operating, a service within half an hour or an hour of that airline, they cannot push up that fare at the last minute. So I think in the current environment, it is impossible for airlines to make a profit. Scheduled airlines, you get more and more entry. That doesn't mean you can't have an institutional constraint. It doesn't mean that they can't, like hotels, differentiate their product. And that's why hotels. I'm going to New York in 10 days' time. I was actually booking a hotel last night. And you get very high prices. But equally, you've got a scarce supply of hotels in the winter, just as you've got a scarce supply of flights tomorrow in the United States. You've got a situation of severe product differentiation in the hotel industry. I mean, you got hotel rooms there where I get sort of everything thrown in for $6,000, or I get a bed and a blanket for $60. I mean, it's a different world to airlines now. And I think if you can get product differentiation, if you've got limited capacity at certain times, you've got limited competition, you can make profit. If you haven't got that, it's very difficult with airlines. Sports teams are the same. It's no accident you have this rather strange game over here you call football, but seem to carry the ball instead. And they limit the number of teams deliberately to do this, because sports arenas are equally a decreasing cost industry.
There's one quality distinction that I think is important. An airline can do a brilliant job of differentiating its product to a limit. It can have gourmet food. It can't have differentiated personnel any longer, but it can have beds and so forth down the line. What it cannot at the present time offer is first in, first out service at every airport in the world. It can't say, we're going to guarantee we'll pay whatever it takes to be the first plane that lands at LaGuardia. And it'd be nice to see what would happen if airlines could basically say, we'll buy our way to the front of the queue. That's a toll road concept, and those of you who've looked at toll roads know it actually can improve the flows and actually improve the equity of the system too. But it's again one of those things we don't even have the ability to think about today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the problems we have in air traffic management is the first come, first served principle, which is actually not in statute, not in regulation.
Oh, that's just custom?
Not in policy. It's in an air traffic manual. It's an internal order that the FAA uses.
Oh.
You're proposing a policy change?
We don't need a policy change, we just need to revoke the manual. But I don't see why we, in the absence of a user fee system or some ability to get to the front of the line, I don't know why we treat everybody the same. And that is a very fundamental problem that the airlines face, because they can't offer a reliable product.
All right, let's go to the crowd. Before I call on somebody, if somebody's willing to raise their hand, otherwise I'm going to call on you, Bob. Fill out the blue slips, please. Obviously, these guys have taken a lot of time and effort to come over here and want your feedback. So, anyone in the crowd have a question?
We've answered all the questions, Jim, there now.
The infrastructure of the airline industry hasn't been deregulated, and it's still government ran. Could you, and I don't see how you can envision that air tower traffic control being run by private organizations unless it was one private organization.
You can, yeah.
You say that there would be separate, you can envision there being separate private companies running that too?
Well, you've got infrastructure, you've got private airports elsewhere, which seem to do pretty well compared to municipal airports in this country. You've got situations with air traffic control where you can outsource the facility and have competition for the provider. So you reduce the costs and get more efficiency from it. Put the air traffic and the tower controls out for auction if you want to, and get the most the person willing to run it at lowest cost with a stipulated standard to do it. You can have competition between control systems. You can have situations where you can divide up territories differently. And I'm thinking of Europe, there's a number of potential flight paths, and you can have different operators operating different flight paths. They do directly compete with each other. Routes across the North Atlantic. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can even remove air traffic control virtually and have these systems that pilots drive a car basically, except they got 3 dimensions and they have a sophisticated radar to make sure they don't bump into each other. You can get to a situation also where you can just have one air traffic control system for the world for flow control. You don't need dozens of different places. Which is the other extreme. And that may be more efficient. The question is, though, where's it going to be located? England, France, America, or wherever? There's a lot of options out there. And there seems to be reluctance to explore anything other than a very, very narrow range of things. And I think one difficulty is that I'd say aviation is sexy. And virtually everyone I know who gets involved in it has got a liking for aircraft, a liking for the industry, and sticking within the industry. That's very strange. In most other industries, people move in and out, and they look at things in different ways. But air transportation does tend to get people who stay in it for their life, and that may be, narrowing the vision.
The question about balkanized, everyone worries about balkanizing an air traffic control system. It's just one undifferentiated airspace. Won't it be awful dangerous to have it subdivided? Well, in fact, if you know air traffic control, we're pretty balkanized already. We've got military controlled space, we've got locally controlled space, we have airport controlled regional space. It's pretty balkanized as it is. It might actually be more integrated in a more market-oriented view. The other is the early air traffic control. Some of them were, in fact, private run, privately created. They had to figure out how to move across mountains safely, so they put beacons at the top of them. It was nationalized like so many things were nationalized, but that was, in a sense, the accident of this industry grew up in a period of collectivist beliefs. Joint ventures could be doing it, and that's how it's done in England, more or less, in lots of places. And the free flight. The president just freed up the air system of America a bit for the holidays. Why not do it for the rest of eternity?
We actually have privately controlled towers in this country. There's a contract tower program.
Yeah.
Actually, I think it represents more than 50% of FAA's towers. Now, they're low activity towers, but they're typically staffed by retired FAA air traffic controllers. They subscribe to a fiction that they don't use radar to separate aircraft, and they don't literally use what FAA would consider radar, but they do, in some situations, I think, in fact, separate aircraft. There's nothing, and this has been our position all along, there's nothing inherently governmental about air traffic control. I mean, it's provided by private companies all over the world. And I think there's tremendous room for competition, and I think a big mistake we could make as a country would be, as we modernize the system, to doing it the old way, which would be having government as the owner and operator of everything. I mean, so oftentimes when I'm asked about this, I hold up this as a prop, and I take a poll, which is the number of people that think that we would have if the FCC owned and operated the telecommunications infrastructure in the United States. And nobody has ever raised. And instead, we would have princess funds, and we'd still have switchboard operators. So, this is a big problem. And until we fix that, I'm not all that optimistic about, air traffic modernization.
There's a great quote in Alan Greenspan's latest book about cell phones in India. He said the Indians thought they were so unimportant they left them to the market, therefore everyone's got one. On the other hand, electricity is so important that the government runs it and no one gets it.
Anyone else? Given where we are in policy, and obviously the president is now very focused on this issue, and we've got a lot of discussions and meetings taking place now about doing something in New York, which would, I think, set a fairly large policy precedent for other congested airports which are coming. The question for you, both of you, Ken, you didn't speak as much about the institutional risks of government solutions. Is it worth pursuing an aggressive market demonstration, in your view, even without major institutional reform? Or do you think that the risks of doing so are outweighed by the benefits?
You've always got a problem in something like aviation. It's a network industry. And fiddling around with one element in it, you're not quite sure what's going to happen elsewhere. So one moves forward with caution when one does if you like, a discrete experiment in the system. But I think that by and large, I would experiment quite simply because unless you do that, no one's going to be convinced of anything. Otherwise, it's just there's an inertia in any government, I'm fearful to say, but there's inertia, and you've got to somehow demonstrate quite clearly that a novel approach, in inverted commas, produces significant improvements. And there's no way of doing it in terms of paper exercises, public policy speeches. You've got to do something. You need someone with enough courage to do it, but as British television used to have a programme called Yes Minister, where the senior civil servant, Sir Humphrey, the minister was going to do something, and Sir Humphrey didn't like the idea, so the civil servant told the minister, "Yes, sir, that's a very courageous decision." So, of course, the minister backed off. I think there's a degree to which you have to force these things through.
New York City is very interesting. It's one of the most important cities in the world, and of course it's also one of the most congested airport situations. One of the things that makes you sort of wonder about that we've thought through creatively enough, the Port Authority more or less controls all three of the regional airports. If you want to have sort of creative interaction, you might imagine, why do they have monopoly control of the three experiments? Their regional approaches are still entangled with one another. Couldn't they have by now, with the Port Authority, have disentangled those approaches and therefore allowed sort of express lanes in each one, so when one airport gets, you don't think it's impossible?
I know at Paris-Charles de Gaulle, they tried to modify just one approach path, which is a spiral. It took them 6 years to work out how to do it.
Well, none of this is going to be easy. The other is the idea, I think it's very important to think about other institutional rigidities. Is it possible to create some way where the airlines and the user groups involved, why not, begin to have more power over the airport and the air traffic control systems? Because it is a problem. What bothers me rushing into congestion pricing or slot allocation is such an easy demand-side management approach. I mean, it's easy to make everything work well when nobody's able to use the system. If you could keep people out of supermarkets every time lines got up, you'd have no lines in supermarkets. But you'd also have lousy food delivery services in America. I'm very much afraid, especially given the tendency of so many groups in the world today to deliberately want to suppress air travel, that if we give this tool too quickly and too readily to the Port Authority and endorsing it in the political process, we may find ourselves with a very functioning airline system in New York City that nobody can afford to use anymore.
Andy, you want the last word?
Well, since we have an ongoing arc on New York, I don't think I should comment on that. I just would point out that the Port Authority is not a master of its own fate. I mean, they can't create their own route. That's FAA decides.
No, I know, I understand that.
What routes and does flow control and all that, and that's sort of part of the problem.
But hasn't there been an initiative for a decade or more to try to separate out those links, to allow some disentanglement of one of the airports from the other two when there's a crisis of one kind or another?
Yeah, I mean, that as a matter of air traffic management,
right.
There is, but there's no sort of overarching plan that would affect what decisions the airlines make about where to operate.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We need to end there.
Yeah.
Before we thank our panelists, and I want to, and also make sure you do fill out those surveys so that we get some feedback.
for future forums. I want to thank Jeff Noble from Mercatus, Chris Meyer, and finally to thank Professor Button, Fred Smith, Tyler Duvall, and Andy Steinberg.
Great, thanks.
Travel safe.